Father Daniel Beaumont knelt before the worn altar of St. Michael's Chapel, a modest stone church nestled in the heart of a sleepy, rural town. The chapel's once vivid stained glass had dulled with time, the scenes of saints and martyrs now blurred by decades of grime. The pews, though polished weekly by Daniel's own hands, were rarely filled. A handful of elderly parishioners attended Sunday Mass, their weary devotion a shadow of the congregation's former vibrancy. Daniel was a man of humble habits and quiet devotion. He had dedicated his life to serving this town, pouring every ounce of his strength into his role as its spiritual shepherd. His cassock was threadbare at the edges, his hands calloused from years of labor, and his eyes carried a sadness that only those who truly believe could understand. The sadness of feeling unheard by the God he so deeply loved. For years, he had prayed fervently for a revival. He asked God for guidance, for a sign that his efforts were not in vain. But the chapel remained quiet, save for the echoes of his own footsteps and the creak of aging wood. Faith, he often reminded himself, was not about seeing miracles. It was about perseverance in the absence of them. It was during one of these late-night prayers, in the cold stillness of the sanctuary, that everything changed. Daniel was on his knees, his rosary beads slipping through his fingers as he murmured prayers into the silence. A single candle burned on the altar, its flickering light casting wavering shadows on the stone walls. The night felt heavy, as though the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Father Daniel. The voice was soft but distinct, cutting through the silence like a blade. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. He glanced around, half expecting to see one of the parishioners who occasionally sought him out for late-night confessions. But the chapel was empty. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. His fingers tightened around the rosary. "I am here," the voice replied. It was gentle, calm, and soothing, yet it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I have heard your prayers, my faithful servant." A flood of emotions surged through Daniel. Fear, awe, and an overwhelming sense of unworthiness. Could it be? Could God himself be speaking to him? He fell prostrate before the altar, tears streaming down his face. "Lord, I am your servant," he whispered. "Tell me what you would have me do." "There is darkness in this house," the voice said. "It must be cleansed." Daniel's heart raced. He had prayed for a sign, and now, after years of silence, he was being called to act. But the voice's words were strange, cryptic. Darkness? The chapel had always been a place of light, a sanctuary for the weary and the lost. "How shall I cleanse it, Lord?" he asked. "Prepare the way," the voice answered. "You will understand in time." The next morning, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. The voice had not spoken again, but its words echoed in his mind. He believed God was guiding him, and he was determined to follow, even if he didn't yet fully understand. He began with small acts. At the voice's urging, he rearranged the sacred objects on the altar, placing the crucifix at a slightly different angle and shifting the chalice to the opposite side. He started burning incense at unusual hours, allowing the fragrant smoke to fill the chapel, even when no one was present. The rituals felt peculiar but harmless, a part of a greater plan that he trusted would be revealed in time. But as the days turned into weeks, his actions began to draw attention. Mrs. Lyle, one of the most devoted parishioners, mentioned the new arrangements during confession. "I don't mean to question, Father," she said hesitantly, "but the altar looks different. Is it part of the liturgy?" Daniel offered her a reassuring smile. "Sometimes a fresh perspective can renew our devotion," he replied. It wasn't untrue, though it wasn't the whole truth either. Others noticed as well. Mr. Carpenter, the aging groundskeeper, remarked on the unusual timing of the incense. "You've been lighting those sticks at odd hours," he said, his tone more curious than critical. "Smells nice, though." Daniel brushed off the comments, reminding himself that faith often required steps that others might not understand. Yet a part of him felt uneasy. Why hadn't the voice spoken again? Was he truly following God's will, or was he letting his imagination run wild? At night, the unease deepened. Daniel began to experience vivid, unsettling dreams. He saw shadowy figures moving through the chapel, their faces obscured and their whispers unintelligible. In one dream, he stood at the altar, but the crucifix above him had been replaced by a dark, horned figure. It loomed over him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. He woke each time drenched in sweat, clutching his rosary as though it could protect him from whatever lingered in the darkness. The dreams felt like warnings, but from whom? Was it God, urging him to continue his work, or something else entirely? The whispers started soon after. At first, Daniel thought they were remnants of his dreams, echoes that lingered as he transitioned from sleep to wakefulness. But they grew louder, more distinct, until he could hear them even during his waking hours. They came when he was alone in the chapel, faint murmurs that seemed to emanate from the shadows. "Cleanse it," the whispers urged. "Cleanse it." The line between divine guidance and something more sinister began to blur. But Daniel clung to his faith. He told himself that he was being tested, that God often worked in mysterious ways. Yet, deep in his heart, a seed of doubt had been planted, a seed that would soon grow into something far darker than he could have imagined. The voice returned after several weeks of silence, stronger now, and with more urgency. Father Daniel had been waiting for its guidance, praying fervently in the cold, quiet hours of the night. When it finally came, it startled him. Not a soft, calming murmur as before, but a firm, commanding tone that seemed to leave no room for hesitation. "Some among you carry the stain of sin," the voice said one night as Daniel knelt before the altar. The candlelight flickered violently, as if responding to the words. They must be separated from the flock. Daniel's heart raced. The idea of singling out members of his congregation felt wrong, even cruel. Yet he reminded himself that God's ways were beyond human comprehension. He nodded, pressing the rosary beads against his trembling lips. "Who, Lord?" he whispered. "Show me the way." The next Sunday, Daniel stood at the pulpit, his sermon sharper than usual. His gaze swept across the sparse congregation, noting every fidget, every lowered head. He spoke of repentance, of the dangers of hidden sin, his words carrying an edge that unsettled even the most devout. By the end of the service, he felt the weight of the voice's guidance pressing upon him. As the parishioners filed out, he lingered by the door, shaking hands and offering blessings. When Mrs. Lyle approached, her soft smile faltered under his intense scrutiny. "Mrs. Lyle," he said, gripping her hand tightly, "I'd like to speak with you after the service." Her face paled, but she nodded. "Of course, Father." Later, in the dimly lit confessional, Daniel confronted her, his voice low but firm. "The Lord has revealed to me that you carry a burden of sin. You must step back from the Eucharist until you've sought his forgiveness." Tears welled in her eyes. I don't understand. I've confessed my sins, Father. I try to live a righteous life." Daniel felt a pang of guilt, but the voice echoed in his mind. "Cleanse the tainted." He held his ground, offering no further explanation. Mrs. Lyle left the church in tears, her faith shaken. Word spread quickly. By the following week, attendance at St. Michael's had dwindled further. The remaining parishioners whispered among themselves, their glances toward Daniel laced with suspicion. Father Beaumont's sermons have taken a strange turn. One woman confided to another after Massachusetts, "It's as if he's looking for something that isn't there." Their unease was amplified by strange occurrences in the church. During evening prayers, the lights would flicker inexplicably, plunging the sanctuary into moments of eerie darkness. Some claimed to feel sudden cold spots, icy drafts that seemed to emanate from nowhere. A young altar boy, Tommy, swore he heard faint whispers coming from the confessional even when it was empty. Daniel dismissed these concerns, though deep down they gnawed at him. He was certain the voice was guiding him toward a higher purpose, even if the path was fraught with challenges. This is a trial, he told himself. Faith requires sacrifice. One night, as Daniel locked the church doors after a late prayer session, he noticed a stray dog lying by the steps. The animal was thin, its ribs visible beneath its matted fur. It raised its head weakly, its dark eyes meeting his. The voice spoke suddenly, sharper than ever. "Remove the beast." It defiles the house of God. Daniel froze. "Lord, it's just a creature, harmless," he murmured, his voice shaking. "Do as I command," the voice insisted. "Cleanse this house." He hesitated, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his keys. The dog whined softly, a pitiful sound that tore at his heart. But the voice grew louder, relentless, its tone like thunder in his ears. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he picked up a heavy rock from the edge of the path. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice breaking. The deed was quick, but the sound of the dog's yelp lingered in his mind long after it had fallen silent. He buried the body in the churchyard, his hands caked with dirt and blood. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his small, sparsely furnished room, staring at his hands, as if the sin had seeped into his skin. The next morning, Daniel was greeted by silence from the voice. The absence felt deafening, like a heavy weight pressing on his chest. He tried to reassure himself that he had done what was necessary, that he had obeyed God's will. But doubt crept in, insidious and persistent. During his evening prayers, the memory of the dog haunted him. The flickering candlelight seemed to cast accusing shadows on the walls, and he thought he heard faint scratching at the church door. He dismissed it as his imagination, but the unease lingered. The following Sunday, his sermon was disjointed, his voice trembling as he spoke. The remaining parishioners exchanged worried glances. Mrs. Carver, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, confronted him after the service. "Father Beaumont," she said, her voice firm, "something's not right. You're not yourself." Daniel stared at her, unable to respond. How could he explain what he himself barely understood? That night, as he knelt in the sanctuary, the voice returned. "Why do you hesitate, Daniel? Have I not shown you the path?" I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "This doesn't feel holy. It feels wrong." The voice softened, almost tender. "Faith is not about what feels right. It is about obedience. Trust in me, and all will be revealed." Daniel nodded, though his heart was heavy. He resolved to continue, to trust in the voice despite his growing doubts. But as he extinguished the candles and locked the doors, a chilling thought crept into his mind, a thought he dared not acknowledge. What if this voice isn't God at all? The air in St. Michael's Chapel felt heavier than ever, as though the very walls were pressing inward. Father Daniel Beaumont had been avoiding his reflection in the mirrors of the church, his eyes drawn to the growing hollowness in his face. Yet the voice continued, its commands more insistent, its presence undeniable. It began with the Hawkins family. Their youngest daughter, 8-year-old Emily, had been suffering from unexplained fits. She would thrash wildly, speak in guttural tones, and scream at unseen forces. The family, desperate for help, turned to Daniel. "This is the darkness I warned you about," the voice declared as Daniel listened to the Hawkins' tearful pleas. "The girl is tainted. Cleanse her." He hesitated, the echoes of his doubts still ringing in his mind. But the family's faces, lined with despair and faith, brought him to his decision. He agreed to perform an exorcism. The ritual was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. He recited the ancient rites, his trembling hands gripping the Bible as Emily writhed in the pews, bound by her father's hands. The storm outside raged with unholy intensity, lightning illuminating the stained glass in grotesque flashes. Each thunderclap seemed to mirror Emily's screams, her voice climbing to unnatural heights. "Hold her steady," Daniel shouted over the chaos. His words felt foreign in his own mouth, as though someone else were speaking through him. Then, as suddenly as it began, the storm ceased. Emily collapsed into her father's arms, her body limp, but her face serene. The family wept, their gratitude spilling forth like a flood. "Praise God!" Mrs. Hawkins cried. But as Daniel looked down at the child, a gnawing unease clawed at him. 2 days later, Emily's older brother approached Daniel. "Father," the boy stammered, his face pale, "Emily wasn't sick. The doctor said it was just a fever. She was already getting better before the exorcism." Daniel forced a smile. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, but the words tasted bitter. The rumors began soon after. Whispers of Daniel's strange behavior spread among the parishioners, fueled by the exorcism and his increasingly erratic sermons. Mrs. Carver, ever vigilant, decided to confront him. "Father, I know you've been keeping a journal," she said one afternoon, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You've been writing down everything the voice tells you." Daniel stiffened. "That journal is private. Forgive me, Father, but I had to know what's been going on." She reached in her bag and pulled out the leather-bound book, its corners worn from handling. "I found this in the vestry." Daniel's breath caught. He snatched the journal from her hands, his voice trembling with anger. "You had no right. And you have no right leading this flock astray," she interrupted. "These entries, they aren't from God. They're cruel. They're evil." "Enough!" Daniel shouted, his voice echoing through the empty chapel. Mrs. Carver flinched but held her ground. "I'm taking this to the bishop," she said firmly. "This has to stop." Before Daniel could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him clutching the journal like a lifeline. The voice was silent that night, but its absence was more terrifying than its commands. Days later, Daniel was approached by Harold Green, a mentally unstable man who often lingered near the church. Harold's ramblings about demons and conspiracies had always unnerved Daniel, but now the voice spoke with clarity. "He is a danger. Protect him from himself. Lock him away." Daniel hesitated. "Lord, surely there's another way. Do as I command." Harold seemed eager to comply when Daniel led him to the church basement. "For your own safety," Daniel said, his voice hollow. He left food and water, promising to return in the morning. But days passed, and Daniel couldn't bring himself to open the basement door. Each time he approached, he heard faint mutterings, incoherent and fevered, echoing from below. By the time he forced himself to descend the steps, the air was thick with the stench of decay. Harold's lifeless body lay crumpled in the corner, his face twisted in agony. Daniel's stomach churned as he whispered a prayer for the man's soul. He reported the death as an accident, claiming Harold had wandered into the basement unnoticed. The town accepted his explanation, but Daniel felt the weight of Harold's death settle heavily on his shoulders. Late one night, Daniel knelt before the altar, the journal open beside him. He flipped through its pages, the inked commands glaring up at him like accusations. "Cleanse the tainted. Remove the beast. Lock him away." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. "Lord," he whispered, his voice breaking, "if this is truly your will, give me a sign." The chapel was silent, save for the soft crackle of the candles. Then, as Daniel lifted his head, he froze. In the reflection of the polished crucifix above the altar, a shadowy figure stood behind him. "Turn around," the voice said, but this time it was no longer soothing. It was a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. His breath caught as he slowly turned. The figure was indistinct, its edges blurred as though it were barely part of this world. Its eyes burned with a deep, malevolent red, and its presence filled the room with a suffocating darkness. "You've done well," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "But there is so much more to do." Daniel stumbled backward, his heart pounding. Who are you?" The figure grinned, revealing jagged, inhuman teeth. "You've always known," it hissed. "You just didn't want to believe." The realization hit him like a blow. This was no angel, no messenger of God. It was something else entirely, something that had been leading him astray all along. As the figure faded into the shadows, Daniel collapsed to his knees, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The voice returned, faint and mocking. "Faith is a fragile thing, Daniel, and now it's mine." The cold winter air seeped into St. Michael's Chapel as Father Daniel lit the last of the altar candles. The flickering flames cast erratic shadows across the walls, which seemed to pulse and breathe with life. He avoided looking at the crucifix. Since the shadowy figure's appearance, it was no longer a symbol of comfort, but a reminder of how far he had strayed. Daniel's prayers were hollow now. The voice had become his constant companion, its once soothing tones dripping with mockery. He felt trapped in a twisted game, powerless to escape, but too terrified to confront the truth. It was late afternoon when Mrs. Carver stormed into the church, her expression a mix of fury and heartbreak. Daniel was in the vestry, sorting through hymnals, when she slammed her hand on the table. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Father, you've lost your way." Daniel looked up, startled. "Mrs. Carver, please." "No," she cut him off, her hands trembling. "I've watched you change over these past months. At first I thought it was stress, maybe doubt. But now I see it's something far worse." Daniel swallowed hard. "I've only done what I believe God has asked of me." Mrs. Carver leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "God? Is that what you think this is? I've read your journal, Father. Those commands, they're not from him." "You had no right," Daniel began, but she slammed the journal down on the table. "I had every right," she snapped. "I'm not the only one who's noticed the darkness surrounding you. The whispers during Mass, the strange flickering lights, the disappearances. Harold Green's death wasn't an accident, was it?" Daniel flinched. "You don't understand. I was saving him." Mrs. Carver's voice cracked with emotion. "That wasn't salvation. That was cruelty." She straightened, her face resolute. "I'm taking this to the bishop. The town deserves to know what's happening here." Daniel reached out as she turned to leave. "Please, Mrs. Carver, don't." Her voice was cold as steel. "I've stayed silent long enough." That night, Mrs. Carver disappeared. The whispers started again that evening. Daniel sat alone in the sanctuary, the journal still on the table where Mrs. Carver had left it. He stared at the altar, his mind racing. "This is your fault," the voice hissed. "You pushed her away. You failed." The candles flickered violently, plunging the church into intermittent darkness. And then, as the last flame extinguished, Daniel saw it. The walls of the church were ablaze, the stained glass melting into grotesque shapes that dripped like wax. The pews were filled with faceless parishioners, their heads jerking unnaturally as though nodding in silent agreement. At the altar stood the horned figure, its red eyes glowing with malevolence. It raised a clawed hand, pointing directly at Daniel. "You did this," it growled. Daniel screamed, the sound echoing through the empty church. When he opened his eyes, the vision was gone. The church was dark and silent, save for the faint creak of the wooden pews. The next night, Daniel stood before the crucifix, clutching his rosary so tightly it cut into his palms. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this to me?" The voice responded, calm and mocking. "You already know the answer, Daniel." The shadows behind the altar shifted, coalescing into the horned figure. It stepped forward, its form barely distinct from the surrounding darkness. "You invited me in." Daniel shook his head. "No, I followed God's will. I prayed." "You prayed to me," the demon interrupted, its grin widening. "Your faith was so desperate, so blind, that you never stopped to question the source of my voice. You wanted to believe you were chosen, and I let you." Daniel's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor. "Why?" he whispered. The demon crouched before him, its glowing eyes inches from his face. "Because faith is delicious, especially when it crumbles." "You wanted revival? A spark of divine purpose? I gave you exactly what you asked for." Daniel felt the weight of his sins crash down on him. The deaths, the fear, the broken trust of his congregation. He had been a puppet, and now the strings were being cut. The following days were marked by chaos. Rumors of Mrs. Carver's disappearance spread like wildfire, fueling suspicions about the church. Families began to report strange happenings. Children waking in the night screaming about shadowy figures. Livestock found mutilated, and unnatural cold spells sweeping through the town. Attendance at St. Michael's dwindled to nothing. The few who dared to enter the church described it as oppressive, the air thick with an unidentifiable stench. The altar candles refused to stay lit, and faint whispers echoed in the silence, even when Daniel was alone. Daniel became a pariah. Townsfolk avoided him on the street, their gazes filled with suspicion and fear. Whispers followed him everywhere. "That man's cursed," an old woman murmured to her neighbor, "bringing ruin to us all." "He's a liar," another man said, "pretending to be holy while the devil's in his church. Daniel withdrew entirely, retreating into the now empty chapel. He wandered the aisles at night, haunted by visions of Mrs. Carver's accusing face, Harold Green's lifeless body, and the horned figure's mocking grin. Daniel no longer prayed. What was the point? He had been abandoned by the God he once served, left to rot in a desecrated house of worship. The voice no longer spoke. It didn't need to. Its work was done, and yet, as Daniel sat in the darkness of the sanctuary, his mind spiraling, a single thought lingered, clawing at the edges of his sanity. If faith was the weapon, could it also be the cure? But before he could find an answer, the shadows around him began to move again. Father Daniel Beaumont stood in the center of the darkened sanctuary, clutching the tools of his desperate salvation: a vial of holy water, a weathered Bible, and a silver crucifix that gleamed faintly in the dim candlelight. The church around him was a husk of its former self, a hollow, haunted shell. Dust clung to the pews like cobwebs, and the air carried the acrid stench of rot. He could feel the demon watching, waiting. "This is my house," Daniel muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. "You have no place here." The demon's laughter slithered through the darkness. It echoed from every corner, a sickly sound that seemed to crawl into Daniel's ears and burrow into his mind. "Still clinging to your faith, Daniel? Haven't you learned by now? Faith is the sweetest lie." Daniel dropped to his knees before the altar, the heavy Bible cradled in his shaking hands. He opened it to the exorcism rites, the familiar Latin words spilling onto the page like lifelines. His voice was steady as he began to read, the ancient incantations filling the space with a fragile power. "Exorcizo te, omnis spiritus immundi, in nomine Dei Patris omnipotentis." The air grew heavy, oppressive. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing as if caught in an unseen wind. Shadows writhed along the walls, growing thicker and more defined. The horned figure emerged from the darkness, its form towering, its red eyes burning with malevolent glee. "You think words will save you?" the demon hissed, its voice low and resonant. "You were mine the moment you doubted." Daniel's grip tightened on the crucifix. "You're a liar," he spat, "and I'm sending you back to the hell you came from." The demon surged forward, its clawed hands swiping at the altar. The force shattered the wooden structure, sending splinters flying. Daniel stumbled back, raising the crucifix as a shield. The demon recoiled briefly, its form wavering, but it quickly regained its strength. The church twisted around him, the stone walls seeming to warp and pulse as if alive. The stained glass windows melted like wax, the vibrant depictions of saints and martyrs dripping into grotesque, unrecognizable forms. The air was filled with unholy sounds, screams, whispers, and the wet squelch of something unseen crawling through the darkness. Daniel's prayers faltered as fear gripped him. The demon seized on his hesitation, stepping closer, its grin widening. "You're no savior," it sneered. "You've spilled blood in my name. You let me in. You fed me." The words struck like a hammer. Daniel's mind raced with images of his failures. Mrs. Carver's disappearance, Harold Green's lifeless body, the innocent dog's blood on his hands. Tears streamed down his face, his voice breaking. I thought I was doing God's work." "You were doing my work," the demon whispered, its voice thick with satisfaction. But desperation lent Daniel strength. He forced himself to his feet, raising the vial of holy water. "You deceived me," he said through clenched teeth, "but I still have the power to cast you out." He hurled the water at the demon, the liquid sizzling as it struck its form. The creature howled, its body convulsing, the shadows around it recoiling. Daniel seized the moment, clutching the crucifix and pressing it forward. "In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti," he shouted, his voice rising with renewed conviction. "Leave this place." The demon writhed, its form beginning to crack and splinter. But as it began to fade, it let out a final, mocking laugh. "You think this absolves you?" it snarled. "You were always a willing servant, Daniel. You may banish me, but you can't escape yourself." The demon's form dissolved into ash, the oppressive darkness lifting as a faint light filled the sanctuary. Daniel collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The air felt lighter, almost peaceful, but the peace was short-lived. As Daniel knelt in the silence, he felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He looked down, horrified, to see faint, dark tendrils writhing beneath his skin. The demon's final words echoed in his mind. "You were always a willing servant." Realization dawned with crushing clarity. The demon hadn't just been in the church. It had been within him. Its influence had seeped into his soul over years of subtle manipulation. The atrocities he had committed weren't entirely the demon's doing. They were his, guided by his own weakness and doubt. Daniel staggered to his feet, his hands shaking as he gripped the crucifix. He felt no relief, no triumph, only a hollow emptiness. The townspeople found Daniel the next morning, slumped in one of the pews, the sanctuary eerily silent. He refused to speak of what had transpired, his eyes distant and haunted. Over time, the church was abandoned, its reputation irreparably tarnished by the rumors of disappearances and curses. Daniel lived out his days in solitude, spending hours in prayer, but finding no solace. He became a shadow of the man he once was, his faith shattered, his soul scarred. Years later, a young priest named Father Matthew arrived in the town, sent by the diocese to assess the possibility of reopening St. Michael's. The chapel was in disrepair, its walls stained with age and neglect. Among the debris, Father Matthew discovered an old leather-bound journal tucked beneath the shattered altar. The entries were chaotic, scrawled in a hand that grew increasingly erratic. The final page bore a chilling warning, written in bold, jagged letters. Faith is a double-edged sword. Know who wields it. Father Matthew closed the journal, a shiver running down his spine. As he left the chapel, he glanced back at the crucifix, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floor.